The Eastern Front, 1944. A land sculpted by misery, a frozen hell where the very air seems to crack with the sound of tyranny and the desperate gasp of freedom. Here, in this whitewashed oblivion, the snow doesn't fall. It settles like a shroud over 1,000,000 unmarked graves. The trees are skeletal hands clawing at a leaden sky, and the wind carries not just the cold, but the stench of cordite, diesel, and death. This is the war beyond all comprehension, a colossal struggle between two titanic forces, and in this vast, impersonal meat grinder, one man is about to become a ghost, a phantom in the snow whose work will echo with a terrifying, silent precision. But for now, he is just a boy from the Pennsylvania coal country, a boy named John Miller, whose world has shrunk to the circle of a rifle scope and the rhythm of his own heartbeat. Look out across the endless white plain, past the hulks of burnt-out tanks like beached metal whales, towards a line of dark firs that conceals a nightmare. The German war machine, the Wehrmacht, is dug in there, a bristling fortress of men and steel, confident, arrogant, and utterly unaware that their number has already been called, one by one. Miller's breath plumes in the sub-zero air, a tiny, transient cloud in a world of permanent winter. He has been here for 18 hours, motionless, his white parka crusted with ice, his body fused to the very landscape. He is not just a soldier, he is part of the terrain, a patient predator in a world of noisy prey. And then, the first target presents himself. A German officer, crisp and clean in his greatcoat, struts along a trench line, barking orders, a picture of invincibility. He is 200 yards away, a mere speck, but in Miller's world, he is already a memory. The crosshairs settle on the man's chest. The world falls away. There is no war, no cold, no fear. There is only the breath, the trigger, and the target. The rifle barks, a single, sharp, almost polite sound that is swallowed instantly by the vast, hungry silence. The officer crumples, a puppet with its strings cut. Confusion ripples through the German line. A stray shot? A lucky hit? They have no idea. They have just met the ghost. And the count has begun. 1. But how does one man, alone in the frozen wilderness, bring an entire army to its knees? And what happens when the hunter becomes the hunted? The initial confusion down the line was a brief, fleeting thing, a stirred anthill that quickly settled. To the Germans, it was a tragedy, a random casualty of a brutal war. They retrieved the body, cursed the faceless enemy, and continued their routine, their sense of security only slightly punctured. They did not connect the dots. How could they? There was no barrage, no probing attack, no sound of an advancing enemy. Just a single, solitary crack that came from nowhere and everywhere at once. For Miller, there was no time for celebration, no moment of grim satisfaction. The shot was a process, a function. Exhale, squeeze, impact, reload. His position, a carefully constructed layer of packed snow and fallen branches, was a masterpiece of fieldcraft. He had chosen it not for a single shot, but for its sightlines to multiple German avenues of approach. A command trench here, a machine gun nest there, a latrine area beyond. He was a spider at the center of a web of death, and the flies were just beginning to buzz. His next target was a machine gun crew, laughing as they shared a cigarette, the glow a perfect beacon in the late afternoon gloom. They were 300 yards out, a difficult shot for most, routine for Miller. He didn't see men, he saw a problem of wind, drop, and trajectory. He adjusted the scope, a fraction of a mildot. The rifle spoke again. The gunner slumped over his weapon. The loader stared, dumbfounded, before a second shot turned his confusion into eternity. 2. 3. Now a different kind of silence descended on the German position. This was no longer bad luck. This was something else, something deliberate. A sergeant, a veteran of the African campaign, began shouting, pointing in the general direction of the tree line. He was organizing a response, his voice a blade of authority cutting through the fear. He never finished his sentence. Miller's fourth shot took him in the throat, silencing him forever. 4. Panic, cold and sharp, began to prickle at the edges of the German unit. Men ducked, their eyes scanning the impenetrable wall of white and green. Where was he? Who was he? How many of them were out there? They were professional soldiers, the best in the world, and they were being systematically dismantled by an enemy they could not see, could not hear, and could not fight. Back in his hide, Miller allowed himself a sip of frozen water from his canteen. His muscles screamed in protest, his body a symphony of pain and cold. But his mind was clear, a crystal-clear lake of lethal intent. He had their attention now. The game had changed. The hunted had become the hunters, but they were hunting a ghost. And with every passing minute, that ghost was claiming another soul, weaving a tapestry of terror one thread at a time. And as the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the snow in hues of blood and fire, a terrifying realization dawned on the German commander. They were not under attack from a unit. They were being erased by a single unstoppable force. Darkness fell, but it brought no respite for the Germans. It only deepened their dread. The unseen marksmen, they reasoned, would be blind in the night. They were wrong. Miller had traded his standard scope for a primitive but effective infrared sniper scope, a bulky apparatus that turned the world into a ghostly green landscape. He was no longer a man of the day. He was a creature of the night, a phantom who saw all while remaining utterly invisible. The German command, rattled and furious, ordered a patrol to sweep the tree line. 12 men, seasoned and wary, moved out from their lines, their figures glowing like pale green ghosts in Miller's scope. They moved with textbook precision, covering each other, their heads on a swivel. They were hunting their phantom. They never stood a chance. Miller's first shot took the point man, the sound a muffled thump in the snow. The patrol hit the deck, their world reduced to the terrifying unknown. A second shot, and the radio operator went still, his hand still clutching the handset. They were pinned, not by machine gun fire, but by an invisible, omniscient reaper. They fired blindly into the trees, muzzle flashes betraying their positions. Miller worked with a cold, mechanical efficiency. 5, 6, 7. He was counting not as a tally of glory, but as a measure of efficiency, a rounds expended calculation. The patrol disintegrated into a frantic, disorganized retreat, leaving their dead and dying in the snow. They had gone out as hunters and returned as prey, their confidence shattered. By dawn, the body count had risen to 15. The German position, once a bastion of order, was now a nest of paranoia. Men were afraid to leave their bunkers, afraid to light a stove, afraid to show their faces above the parapet. A single, well-aimed shot had done what an artillery barrage could not. It had broken their will. But Miller's war was not without cost. The cold was a living entity, seeping into his bones. His fingers were numb, his feet blocks of ice. Every movement was agony. He had to change positions, a dangerous maneuver that would expose him, if only for a moment. As he began the slow, painful process of extracting himself from his frozen cocoon, he heard a new sound cutting through the morning air. Not the bark of a rifle, but the low, guttural growl of a German armored vehicle. It was a half-track, mounting a heavy machine gun, and it was rumbling directly towards his sector, its intention clear, to flush him out or grind him into the mud. The ghost was about to be cornered.
The half-track was a beast of iron and menace, its tracks churning the pristine snow into brown slush. Mounted on top, a gunner swiveled the heavy MG-42, its barrel sweeping back and forth across the tree line like the antenna of some predatory insect. This was no longer a battle of stealth. It was about to become a brutal, direct confrontation. Miller froze, his body pressed flat against the frozen ground, his white parka the only thing between him and instant death. He was trapped. To move was to be seen. To stay was to be overrun. The engine's roar vibrated through the earth, a sensation felt in his teeth. He could smell the diesel fumes now, thick and oily. The vehicle was 50 yards away, then 40, closing fast. The machine gunner hosed down a cluster of trees to Miller's left, the rounds chewing through bark and branch with a sound like tearing canvas. Splinters rained down around him. This was it. His mind raced, discarding one suicidal plan after another. He couldn't outrun it. He couldn't hide forever. His eyes fell on a small, exposed tree root a few feet away, coated in a thick layer of clear ice. It was a desperate, insane gamble. As the half-track ground to a halt barely 30 yards from his position, the gunner pivoting towards his sector, Miller made his move. In one fluid, desperate motion, he raised his rifle, not aiming at the gunner, but at the icy root just in front of the half-track's left track. He fired. The high-velocity round shattered the ice, but more importantly, it struck the hardened root beneath, ricocheting with a high-pitched whine. It was a 1-in-a-million shot. The deflected round slammed directly into the thin side armor of the half-track's engine compartment with a sharp spang. A geyser of steam and smoke erupted from the crippled vehicle. The engine coughed, sputtered, and died. The machine gunner, startled and confused, swung his weapon wildly, firing blind. Inside, the crew was shouting, scrambling to assess the damage. They were sitting ducks. Miller didn't hesitate. He shifted his aim, the scope centering on the gunner's exposed head. 18. The man crumpled. Another crewman popped the hatch to see what had happened. 19. In less than 10 seconds, the threatening armored vehicle was transformed into a silent, steaming coffin. The remaining crew inside decided discretion was the better part of valor and stayed put. The immediate threat was neutralized. But the sound of the engagement, the roar of the half-track's machine gun and Miller's responding shots, had drawn the attention of the entire German battalion. They now knew his approximate location. A chorus of shouts and whistles echoed from the enemy line. A company of infantry, perhaps 100 men, began to form up for a proper, organized assault on the tree line. They were coming for him, and this time they would not stop until they had his head on a pike. Miller had won the battle, but he had just started the war.
100 enraged soldiers, their fear now transformed into a burning, vengeful fury, began to advance across the snowfield. This was no longer a patrol. It was a tidal wave of gray-green, a determined, methodical sweep designed to crush anything in its path. Bullets began to snap through the trees around Miller, not aim shots, but a massive volume of fire intended to keep his head down while they closed the distance. The air was thick with the sound of screaming officers, barking NCOs, and the relentless crackle of rifle fire. Miller was in the fight of his life. He had to move, and move now. Abandoning his precious hide, he low-crawled backwards, his body scraping through the snow and frozen undergrowth. Every inch was a victory. He reached a secondary position he had scouted days before, a shallow depression behind a fallen pine tree. It was poor cover, but it would have to do. The advancing line was 200 yards out and closing. He had to slow them down. He picked his targets with ruthless priority. Officers first. A lieutenant waving his men forward suddenly spun and fell. 20. Then the NCOs. A sergeant urging his squad on took a round to the chest. 21. The machine gunners setting up to provide covering fire. 1. 22. 2. 23. Each shot was a statement. Each fall sent a ripple of hesitation through the advancing tide. They would hit the dirt, scan the trees, fire blindly, then get up and advance again, but slower now, more cautiously. Miller was a one-man delaying action, his rifle the only thing holding back an entire company. His bolt worked like a piston, ejecting smoking brass, chambering a fresh round. His world was a cycle of breathe, aim, squeeze, reload. The smell of burnt cordite filled his nostrils, a familiar, acrid perfume. He could feel the heat of the barrel through his gloves. How many rounds did he have left? 30? 20? He lost count of the tally, his focus entirely on survival. The Germans were 100 yards away now. He could see their faces, contorted in anger and fear. They knew he was close. A potato masher grenade sailed through the air and exploded harmlessly 30 yards to his right, showering him with snow and dirt. They were getting his range. He took down the grenade thrower. 24. But it was like trying to stop a flood with a bucket. They were flanking him, moving to his left and right. He was being surrounded. His rifle clicked empty. He reached for another stripper clip, his numb fingers fumbling, dropping it into the snow. He scrabbled for it, desperation clawing at his throat. This was how it ended. Not with a bang, but with a fumble in the snow, overrun in a nameless Russian forest. As his fingers closed around the cold metal of the clip, a new sound erupted from the sky. The deafening, earth-shattering roar of artillery. The world exploded. Not in front of him, but behind the advancing German company. A massive artillery barrage, a rolling thunder of high explosives, walked its way across the snowfield, churning the earth into a hellscape of fire, smoke, and flying shrapnel. The Soviet guns had finally spoken. The German advance shattered instantly. Men were thrown through the air like rag dolls. The orderly lines dissolved into chaos as soldiers broke and ran, trying to escape the steel rain falling from the sky. Miller pressed himself into the earth, the concussions pounding his chest, deafening him. Tree branches sheared off and fell around him. This was salvation and peril all at once. The barrage was a wall of destruction separating him from the enemy, but it was indiscriminate. A shell landing 50 yards to his left would be just as lethal as one landing on a German. He was in no man's land, caught between the hammer and the anvil. For 5 eternal minutes, the storm raged. Then, as suddenly as it began, it ceased. An eerie, ringing silence descended, broken only by the moans of the wounded and the crackle of burning trees. The German assault had been obliterated. Miller raised his head, his ears bleeding, his body trembling from the concussive forces. The snowfield was a vision of hell. Craters smoked, bodies lay scattered and broken. The few surviving Germans were in full retreat, stumbling back to their lines. He had survived. But he was not alone. Through the drifting smoke, he saw movement. A small group of German soldiers, perhaps a dozen, had been caught ahead of the barrage and were now trapped in the shattered landscape between their lines and Miller's position. They were disoriented, leaderless, and desperate. And they were moving right towards him. They hadn't seen him yet, their attention focused on the safety of their own lines. Miller was faced with an impossible choice. He could let them pass, hope they didn't discover him, and live to fight another day. Or he could engage, revealing his position to any remaining observers and eliminate this last stranded pocket of the enemy. His mission was to inflict maximum damage, to be a thorn in the side of the German army. Letting them go felt like a dereliction of duty. As the first of the stranded soldiers, a young private no older than himself, stumbled within 20 yards of his position, their eyes met. The German's face was a mask of grime and terror. He fumbled with his rifle, his movements slow with shock and cold. Miller didn't think. He acted. The shot was deafening at such close range, 25. The other Germans scattered, diving for cover in the shell craters. They now knew where he was. The brief respite was over. The last battle of the day was about to begin, and it would be a brutal, close-quarters fight to the death. The trapped Germans were not a cohesive unit anymore. They were a cornered animal, and that made them infinitely more dangerous. They fanned out, using the fresh artillery craters as makeshift trenches. They knew they had to silence this sniper to have any hope of getting back to their lines. The dynamic had shifted from a large-scale assault to a deadly, intimate game of cat and mouse in a field of destruction. Miller was pinned down behind his log. A bullet smacked into the wood inches from his face, sending splinters stinging into his cheek. He returned fire, catching a German who was trying to flank him on his right. 26. The return fire intensified. They were coordinating now, laying down suppressing fire while one or two tried to maneuver. A potato masher grenade arced through the air, landing with a soft thud in the snow a few feet from his position. Time seemed to slow. There was no time to throw it back. With a guttural roar, Miller shoved himself backwards, away from the log, just as the grenade detonated. The blast was stunning, a physical force that slammed the air from his lungs and filled his vision with white-hot light. He was thrown onto his back, his rifle knocked from his grasp. His head rang, his world a dizzying swirl of sky and smoke. He was deafened, disoriented, and utterly vulnerable. Through the tinnitus whine, he could hear the Germans shouting to each other, their voices growing closer. They thought they had him. They were coming to finish the job. His vision swam, focusing on his rifle lying in the snow just out of reach. It was his lifeline, his only chance. He crawled for it, his body screaming in protest, every movement a fresh agony. His fingers brushed the cold stock, just as a German soldier vaulted over the log, his bayonet fixed, a triumphant snarl on his face. He was on top of Miller, the sharp, cruel point of the bayonet descending towards his chest. This was it. The ghost was about to be made flesh, and then made corpse. Instinct, honed by 1,000 hours of training and a primal will to live, took over. Miller rolled, the bayonet plunging into the snow where his heart had been a second before. The German, overbalanced, stumbled forward. Miller's hand, still scrabbling for his rifle, found not the stock, but the sharp, heavy bayonet he kept strapped to his leg. He wrenched it free, and in the same motion, drove it upwards with all the strength he had left. It was not a clean kill. It was a messy, brutal, close-quarter struggle. The German gasped, a wet, choking sound, his eyes wide with shock and pain. He collapsed on top of Miller, his weight immense. Miller shoved the body aside, his own body slick with the man's blood. 27. He had no time for horror, no time for thought. He grabbed his rifle, rolled into a nearby crater, and chambered around. The other Germans were closing in, emboldened by the silence. They thought their comrade had succeeded. Miller rose from the crater like an apparition from the grave. He fired twice in rapid succession. 28. 29. 2 more Germans fell. The remaining few, perhaps 4 or 5, froze, their courage finally broken. The sight of their comrades falling and this blood-soaked specter rising from the earth was too much. They dropped their weapons and raised their hands in surrender, their faces pale with a terror that went beyond the fear of death. It was the terror of the supernatural. Miller stood, panting, his body trembling with adrenaline and exhaustion. He looked at the surrendering men. They were boys, just like him. But he couldn't take prisoners. He couldn't escort them back. His war was one of shadows and silence. He lowered his rifle and gestured with his bayonet towards the German lines. "Geh," he grunted, his voice a ragged whisper. "Go." They didn't need telling twice. They scrambled away, stumbling through the snow, back towards their own hell. Miller watched them go, then sank to his knees in the crater. The immediate fight was over. He had survived the impossible. But as he looked at his blood-stained hands and his nearly empty ammunition pouches, he knew this was only the beginning. The Germans now knew his face. They had felt his sting. And an enemy that has been humiliated is an enemy that will stop at nothing for revenge. The ghost had been seen, and the hunt for the man named John Miller was about to begin in earnest. The silence that followed the close-quarters battle was profound, broken only by the moaning wind that swept across the cratered field. Miller was a wreck. His parka was torn and stained with blood, both his and the enemy's. A sharp, throbbing pain in his ribs suggested a bruise or worse from the grenade blast. His ears still rang, and a deep, bone-gnawing fatigue threatened to overwhelm him. But he was alive. He took stock. Ammunition, less than a dozen rounds left. Food, a single, rock-hard piece of hardtack. Water, a few sips. He had to resupply, and he had to move. His position was completely compromised. Using the cover of the craters and the gathering twilight, he moved from body to body, a grim reaper collecting his due. He took ammunition from the dead Germans, his movements swift and efficient, his emotions locked away in a deep, dark corner of his mind. He couldn't afford to feel anything now. Feeling would lead to hesitation, and hesitation would lead to death. He also took their bread, their chocolate, their water. It was a brutal necessity. As he worked, he could hear the Germans in their main line. They were not quiet. The sound of engines, shouted orders, and the distinct guttural sound of an angry professional military force being tasked with a singular purpose carried across the frozen air. They were bringing up their own specialists. He knew what that meant. Counter-snipers. The hunters of hunters. Men just like him, with the same skills, the same patience, and the same cold-eyed determination to put a bullet between his eyes. The game was escalating. He was no longer hunting regular infantry. He was about to be locked in a duel of wits and will against his own mirror image. He finished his grim harvest and began to move, not towards the American lines, but deeper into the contested forest, parallel to the German position. He needed a new lair, a perfect spot from which he could observe the observers and kill the killers. He found it an hour later, a shell-shattered church tower in a long-abandoned village on the edge of the forest. It offered a commanding 360-degree view of the approaches. It was also an obvious spot, a death trap, which is exactly why he chose it. They would expect him to hide in the deep woods. They would not expect him to occupy the most prominent landmark for miles. As he began the careful, silent ascent up the crumbling stone staircase, he knew he was walking into a trap of his own making. But sometimes the best way to hide is to stand in plain sight, waiting for your enemy to make the first mistake. The church tower was a skeleton of its former self, the roof long gone, the bells lying in a broken heap amongst the pews below. The wind whistled through the open stone arches, a lonely, mournful sound. Miller settled into a corner where two walls met, giving him cover from two sides, and a narrow, shadowed firing slit that looked out over the snow-covered village and the forest beyond. He arranged a pile of rubble to conceal his shape and spent the remaining hours of darkness making the position his own. He cleared fields of fire, noted ranging landmarks, and created a small hidden escape route through a hole in the floor leading down to the choir loft. As the sun rose, casting long, stark shadows across the snow, the waiting began. This was the true test of a sniper. Not the shooting, but the waiting. The mind-numbing, body-freezing inertia. Hours bled into one another. He ate a small piece of the German chocolate, letting it dissolve slowly on his tongue. He sipped his water sparingly. He did not move. His body became part of the stone. Down below, in the tree line at the edge of the village, he saw a flicker of movement. A bird, startled from its perch. Then, nothing. But he knew. They were here. He scanned the area slowly, methodically, his scope probing every shadow, every fallen log, every possible hiding place. It was like looking at a perfectly still painting, searching for the one brushstroke that was out of place. An hour passed, then 2, and then he saw it. 1,000 yards out, near the base of a large pine tree, a tiny, almost imperceptible glint. Sunlight on glass. A scope. He had found one of them. Or rather, one of them had been careless enough to let him find them. The counter-sniper was good, his hide nearly perfect. But nearly wasn't good enough. Miller didn't adjust his position. He didn't even let his crosshairs linger on the spot for too long. He simply noted it, filed it away. This was a dance, and the first one to move would lead. He continued his scan and found a second one, 400 yards to the left of the first, positioned in the loft of a bombed-out barn. They had him in a crossfire. They were waiting for him to give away his position by taking a shot. They were patient. But Miller was more patient. He settled in, his breathing slow and steady. He would let the cold and the boredom work for him. He would let them wonder if he was even there. He would let them make the first move. The duel had begun, a silent, deadly chess match where the stakes were a heartbeat and the price of a mistake was eternity. And as the morning wore on, a new player entered the game. A German spotter plane, a slow, buzzing Fieldcraft Storch, began to circle high above the village, its crew scanning the ground below with powerful binoculars. The noose was tightening. The faint, buzzing drone of the Fieldcraft Storch was a sound of pure menace. It circled like a vulture, a lazy, arrogant presence in the gray sky. Miller knew what it meant. They were using eyes in the sky to triangulate his position. If the spotter saw so much as a shadow out of place in the church tower, it would call down artillery fire or direct the counter-snipers onto his exact location. He had to become a statue, a part of the rubble. He didn't dare look up, knowing the pale oval of his face would be a beacon. He kept his head down, his scope focused on the 2 known counter-sniper positions. They hadn't moved. They were waiting for the plane to do its work. The standoff was a nerve-shredding test of endurance. The plane made pass after pass. Miller could feel the eyes of the crew scouring the tower, could almost feel their gaze on his back. Minutes felt like hours. Then he saw his chance. The counter-sniper in the barn loft, perhaps growing restless or overconfident with the plane overhead, shifted his position slightly. It was a tiny movement, just a few inches, but it was enough to expose the tip of his rifle barrel from the shadows. It was the mistake Miller had been waiting for. He had to make a choice. A shot would reveal his position to the plane and the other sniper instantly, but it was an opportunity he couldn't pass up. He made a calculation. The shot was difficult, over 600 yards, at a small, partially obscured target. He took a final calming breath, let it half out, and squeezed the trigger. The shot echoed across the silent village. Through his scope, he saw a puff of splinters from the windowsill of the barn loft. The exposed rifle barrel jerked, and then was still. 30. He didn't wait to see more. The instant the shot broke the silence, he was moving. He rolled from his position, scrambled through the hole in the floor, and dropped down into the choir loft below. Just in time. A split second later, a high-velocity round smacked into the stone where his head had been, followed by the distant crack of the second counter-sniper's rifle. The spotter plane's engine note changed, becoming more urgent. He had been found. From the choir loft, he had a different, more limited field of view. He saw the Storch bank steeply and begin a low pass directly over the church. He knew what was coming next. They were going to call in the coordinates. He had maybe a minute, 2 at most, before the first artillery shells started to fall. He had to get out of the church. But the open ground between the church and the forest was a killing field covered by the remaining counter-sniper. He was trapped in a stone coffin, and the hammer was about to fall. The world dissolved into a maelstrom of sound and force. The first 105 shell hit the base of the tower with a cataclysmic roar, shaking the entire church to its foundations. Stone dust and debris rained down on Miller in the choir loft. The second shell hit the nave, blowing out the remaining stained glass windows in a glittering cascade of colored shrapnel. The Germans weren't trying to pinpoint him. They were trying to bring the entire structure down on top of him. He had to move, now. Staying low, he scrambled down the main staircase, now littered with falling masonry. The air was thick with dust, making it hard to see and harder to breathe. Another direct hit on the tower sent a massive stone block crashing down the stairwell, blocking his path to the main door. He was sealed in. The only way out was through the side of the building. He changed direction, moving towards a gaping hole in the wall where a shell had already struck. As he reached the opening, a machine gun opened up from the tree line, stitching a line of bullets across the wall, pinning him down. The remaining counter-sniper had a friend. He was completely boxed in, artillery from above, machine gun fire from the front, and a collapsed stairwell behind him. The church groaned around him, a dying beast. A section of the ceiling in the choir loft gave way, crashing down in a thunderous roar. He was running out of time and options. He looked through the hole in the wall, assessing the machine gun's position. It was set up in a second-story window of a house about 400 yards away. He couldn't take it out with his rifle. The moment he showed himself, he'd be cut in half. He needed a diversion. His eyes fell on a dead German soldier, one of the ones from the previous day's fight, his body half buried in rubble near the altar. It was a macabre, desperate plan. Fighting against the concussions and the falling debris, he dragged the stiff corpse to the hole in the wall. Taking a deep breath, he shoved the body out, propelling it into the open ground just outside. As he hoped, the machine gunner took the bait, firing a long burst into the corpse, shredding the already dead flesh. In that 1-2-second window, Miller leaned out, his rifle already shouldered. He ignored the machine gun nest. That wasn't the primary threat. His scope found the tree line, where the second counter-sniper had to be watching, his finger on the trigger, waiting for the man who had just dashed into the open. Miller saw the faintest muzzle flash from a cluster of rocks. He fired a single shot, not expecting a hit, but forcing the sniper to duck. Then, without a second's hesitation, he launched himself out of the hole, landing hard in the snow outside and rolling immediately behind the cover of a low stone wall. The machine gunner, realizing his mistake, swiveled his weapon, but Miller was already gone, hidden by the wall. He was out of the church, but he was far from safe. The artillery barrage was now walking towards his new position, and he was in the open, with a machine gun to his front and a master sniper to his flank. The chase was on. Miller ran, his body screaming in protest. He moved in a low, zigzagging sprint, using the cover of the crumbling village walls, the shell craters, the burned-out husks of cars. Behind him, the church tower gave a final groaning shudder and collapsed in on itself, sending a massive cloud of dust and debris billowing into the sky. The machine gunner tracked him, bullets kicking up fountains of snow and stone chips around his feet. He dove behind the burned-out chassis of a T-34 tank, the metal still warm from a recent firefight. The machine gun round spanged harmlessly off the thick armor. He was safe for a moment, but trapped. He needed to silence that MG-42. He risked a glance around the side of the tank. The machine gunner was still firing from the second-story window. It was a clear shot, but a dangerous one. The counter-sniper was still out there, waiting for him to take it. This was the duel, distilled to its purest form. He had to outthink his opponent. He formulated a plan in seconds. He took a large piece of shrapnel from the ground and, staying low, threw it high into the air so it landed on the other side of the tank with a loud clatter, a classic diversion. As he hoped, the counter-sniper, anticipating a move, fired a single shot at the source of the sound, his round pinging off the tank's hull. The sniper had revealed his exact position. Now it was Miller's turn. He popped up from the opposite side of the tank, not where the sound had come from, his rifle already aimed at the machine gun nest. He didn't have a clear shot at the gunner himself, but he didn't need one. He fired twice, rapid fire, into the wooden frame of the window. The first round blew splinters into the gunner's face. The second shattered the window frame, causing the heavy MG-42 to slump, its barrel pointing harmlessly at the sky. The machine gun fell silent. Immediately, Miller dropped back into cover. A fraction of a second later, the counter-sniper's round smacked into the armor where he had just been. The hunter had become the prey again. But Miller now had the advantage. He knew where the sniper was, and the sniper knew he knew. It was a stalemate, but one that favored the man who was closer to his own lines. Miller began to move again, using the cover to work his way around, flanking the sniper's position. He moved with a predator's grace, his every sense heightened. He was no longer just surviving, he was hunting the man who was sent to hunt him. He finally saw him, a well-camouflaged figure nestled amongst the rocks, his focus entirely on the tank, waiting for Miller to appear again. He never saw Miller approach from his blind side. Miller was 50 yards away. He raised his rifle, the crosshairs settling on the center of the man's back. He could end it. One shot. 31. But he didn't take it. Something stayed his hand. This wasn't a machine gunner or a faceless officer. This was a man like him, a professional, a mirror. Killing him felt different. It felt personal. In that moment of hesitation, the German sniper, sensing a presence, began to turn. Their eyes met across the snowy ruins, and in that frozen moment, Miller saw not an enemy, but a reflection of his own weary, war-torn soul. The world held its breath. In the German sniper's eyes, Miller saw the same cold calculation, the same weariness, the same grim acceptance of a life lived in the crosshairs. He saw a man who had also counted his kills, who also felt the bone-deep cold, who also dreamed of a home he might never see. It was a connection forged in the shared, solitary hell of their profession. The German's rifle was still pointed away from him. Miller's was aimed true. It would be the easiest shot he'd taken all week. But his finger rested on the trigger guard, not the trigger. The German, slowly, deliberately, moved his hand away from his rifle and gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. It was a gesture of respect, an acknowledgement of the draw. He would not fight. He was granting Miller his life, and in return, Miller was granting him his. It was a truce between two kings of a dead world. Miller lowered his rifle a fraction of an inch, returning the nod. Without another word, he turned and melted back into the forest, leaving the German sniper to his thoughts and his war. The duel was over. There was no victory, only survival. Miller moved for hours, putting distance between himself and the village, the church, the memory of the face in the rocks. He finally stumbled into a Soviet reconnaissance patrol who, after a tense few moments, recognized the bloodied, frozen American and brought him back to his own lines. The debriefing was a blur. They didn't believe him at first. 50 confirmed kills? It was the stuff of legend. But the radio intercepts of frantic German communications, the reports from forward observers, and the body count left on the field told a story that couldn't be denied. John Miller, the coal miner's son from Pennsylvania, had become a ghost, a myth, a one-man army who had held a sector of the front against impossible odds. He was put in for the Medal of Honor. But for Miller, the war was over. The memories of the faces, the young private, the surrendering boys, the German sniper, would haunt him long after the guns fell silent. He had done his duty. He had become a hero, but the cost was etched into his soul, a permanent winter in his heart. He had been a sniper, a phantom in the snow, and though he had returned to the world of the living, a part of him would forever remain in that frozen forest, a silent witness to the terrible, intimate price of a long war.